thanks everyone for joining, first of all. I'm delighted to have Professor Ito Peng with us today. She is the Canadian Research Chair in Global Social Policy and the Director of the Centre for Global Social Policy at the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. Have I got that right? There's quite a few titles.
It's a long
affiliations. It is quite long. And Professor and myself met online recently, and she was informing me that she was presenting at the most recent UN meeting in Johannesburg for thinking about gender statistics. That was last Friday, was it, or last week? Either way. Yeah. Okay, great. You're on mute, just so you know you're on mute. So what we thought we would think about in particular is, there has been a lot of talk for a long time about trying to how we measure care, how we measure the unpaid work that takes place in our households, in our communities, in our societies across the world, and how that would have particular, I suppose, manifestations or complications or complexities in places in the global south, but not only in the global south, but here in Southern Africa and in and the different parts. But so that's something we're going to think about and hear from Professor today. What we're going to do is she's going to talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to engage in a bit of a conversation. I have a couple of questions based on some of my thinking in this work or some of the queries I've had in trying to tackle these issues. And then we're obviously going to open it up to everyone. So I'm very excited and I'm very grateful for Professor Peng, who actually is physically here in Cape Town and who I will have the pleasure of having meeting this afternoon in person. But I'm very grateful that she is now on Southern African time, and we can hear from her. So I'll hand it over to you. And thanks again from everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elena, for your introduction. And I'm really excited to talk about sort of my meeting at in Johannesburg last week. So let me start with my talk. My talk is Measuring the Invisible, Gender Statistics and the Care Economy in Southern Africa. So I should start out by saying that first of all, I am not a statistician nor an expert in Africa's care economy. I'm just sort of being sort of honest about this. So it's more like I'll be learning from you rather than sort of saying much about the African care economies in African context. I'm a professor of sociology and public policy who's actually specialized in global policies and on gender care, migration, and the care economy. And so I'm coming from a pretty global perspective. So for my talk today, it's as follows. If you could switch to the next slide, please. So I would like to talk about four things. First is, as an introduction, I want to say why I am here in South Africa, and then talking more specifically about the 9th UN Global Forum on Gender Statistics that I attended last week, and a couple of my projects. That's the reason for why I'm attending that. And then secondly, I'll talk about the importance of gender statistics in the care economy, and I'll try to put in some Southern African and larger African and global context. And then in the third part of my talk, I'll talk about some of the learnings that I have gathered from this 9th UN Global Forum on Gender Statistics. And then lastly, I'll talk about some of the challenges and opportunities to look at gender statistics and data on care and care economy. Okay, next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about why I came to South Africa last week. I was invited by the UN Statistics Division and the African Statistics South Africa to come and give presentation about the care economy and gender statistics as related to my research. They asked me to come because I currently lead two large global partnership projects. One of this is called the Care Economies in Context, which tries to kind of empirically map out and measure the shapes and sizes of care infrastructures. And by that, I mean both paid and unpaid care work, including child care, elder care, the care of the disabled people, and other forms of care that's been done both in formal and informal sectors in 9 different countries in 4 different regions, including Africa, and to use this data to develop macroeconomic models of care economies in these countries. The overall goal of this project is really to inform government and policymakers to make necessary policy reforms and to invest in care, and particularly in unpaid care work. My other global project that I'm involved in is a Rockefeller Foundation and Brookings Institute chaired project called 17 Rooms Flagship Initiative. And in this project, it's named 17 Rooms because it tries to align with the UN's 17 SDGs. I serve as the co-lead for the Room 5, which focuses on gender equality. So 17 Rooms projects tries to offer some new and interesting approaches to generating practical actions and insights across the diverse constituencies working to advance SDGs. And within this flagship, sort of each SDG focused rooms meet kind of regularly over the years to come up with 1 to 3 actionable steps that the room identifies. So in the Room 5, we decided to focus on intersecting the issue of care and climate change at local level, with particular focus on the practical ways to address the compounding effects of climate-induced stressors on women and girls' caregiving responsibilities. And so we're exploring cities and municipal level innovations and experimentations and looking at what these cities are currently doing to address climate and care simultaneously. And we're developing many of options that cities and municipalities can implement to address these objectives. Anyway, in both of these projects, we need a lot of data to help us analyze the magnitude of care work, both paid and unpaid, being done by women and men, and the implications of and the impacts of this work on them and their families and the communities and for the national economy. In the case of my first project, Care Economies in Context, we are collecting our own data on paid work, care work, and unpaid caregiving done by women and men, as well as doing some secondary data analysis of existing national data, such as the time use survey data, labor force survey data, and general household surveys. In the case of the second project on the Room 5 of the 17 rooms, we're collecting data on local and national government policies on care and data on climate change and the impacts of the climate change on women and men and on vulnerable populations such as children, older people, people with disability, and other vulnerable groups. So this is a kind of really long way to explain why I was invited to the UN Global Forum on the Gender Statistics. I wonder if you could slide to next slide, please. So now let me talk a bit about the importance of gender statistics and care economies in helping us understand the extent of unpaid care, what national statistics and data tells us about paid and unpaid care, and what are the challenges and sort of opportunities in producing such data in Southern Africa. So first, let me I just want to say that gender statistics and data are very important for us to show very explicitly the amount of unpaid care work that is being done by men and women every day across the globe. So for this, we need data from such surveys as time use surveys, labor force surveys, and household and demographic data, because they show sort of who's doing how much paid and unpaid care work within households and within communities. And in addition, what are the sort of household compositions? So things like sizes of the households, age groups of the members of the households, and current and future demographic trends such as fertility rates and population aging sort of statistics. So, for example, if you could move to the next slide. So for this sort of figure actually comes out from the ILO's report on care work and care economy, published in 2017. This is a very simple sort of table that uses the time use survey data from the 2025. What this shows very clearly is how much time men and women spend on unpaid care work and unpaid care work. So what you see here is that across the world, women spend more than 3 times more amount of time doing unpaid care work compared to men. And in the case of Africa, women spend something like 3.4 times more in doing unpaid care work than men do, whereas in North America, women probably spend about 1.7 times more. This is important because it really shows that kind of disparities between how much men and women spend in unpaid care work, and which in turn has implications for women's ability, for women to attend education or take up paid employment. And it also have implications on the women's career advancement and ability to participate in other social and economic and political activities. If you could move to the next slide, thank you. So here I tried to look for figures, more specific figures for Southern Africa, but the only ones that there are data for in terms of the time use surveys in Southern Africa is South Africa and Madagascar. There is unfortunately no data for other Southern African countries such as Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, or Mozambique. Presumably because there is no time use survey done yet in these countries. So if you look at this table, this figure, you see that in Canada, where I'm from, women spend something like 257 minutes per day doing unpaid care work, while men spend about 170 minutes. That means women spend about 1.5 times as much time doing unpaid care work. In the case of South Africa, women spend about 229 minutes a day, whereas men spend about 98 minutes. That's about 2.3 times as more. And of course, in Madagascar, women spend something like 222 minutes, whereas men spend about 51 minutes in unpaid care work. So in Madagascar, women actually spend over 4 times as much time in doing unpaid care work as compared to men. Similar things can be said about Mali and Tanzania as well, although they're not in Southern Africa. So could we go back to the earlier slide? One more. Yes, thank you. So that's the reason why sort of data is important, because it really shows explicitly how much time men and women spend on paid and unpaid care work. The second reason why data is important is that these data not only sort of quantify, show clearly the amount of paid and unpaid care work that's been done by whom, but also we can use them to calculate the size of this work and the economic values of this work. I'm sorry, cleaners are actually doing the vacuum cleaning outside, so it might be a little bit noisy here. So what happens is that with time use survey data, we can actually calculate the monetary value of unpaid care work that's been done within the households and communities. So this is important because our National Economic Accounting System, or the GDP, actually doesn't include unpaid care work. In fact, it doesn't account any of the non-market and non-monetary transactions that happens in the economy. And because GDP only takes account of the formal economic and financial transactions related to products and services that take places in formal market. So this is really particularly significant because in many lower and middle income countries, not only are there a lot of unpaid care work being done by family and community, particularly by women, but there is a huge informal market in which even the paid care and domestic work and exchanges of services are happening. That's not been taken into consideration in the national GDP. So according to ILO, the value of unpaid care work would come to something like 9 to 10% of the global GDP. This is about 11 trillion US dollars. That's based on the hourly minimum wage. But this is a very conservative estimate. And of course, the value of unpaid care work in terms of the percentage of GDP varies from country to country. And it ranges from as high as something like 40% in New Zealand to as low as 2% in Kyrgyzstan. And so just to give you sort of some comparators, according to Statistics Canada's most recent calculation, the value of unpaid housework is anywhere between something like to 37% in Canada. And then according to the ILO's estimate, the value of unpaid work in South Africa is something like 9% of the GDP. In Mali, it's about 7.6%. Madagascar, it's close to 11% of the total GDP. So these calculations, as I said, are very important for us because once we could quantify and calculate the value of unpaid care work to national economy, then we'll be able to sort of more able to convince the government, and particularly key economic ministries such as Ministries of Finance and Ministry of Economic Planning to think about investing in care and care work. And we won't be able to do this without the kind of data, particularly sort of gender disaggregated data, such as the time use surveys, general household surveys, and labor force surveys. Now, could we advance the slide, please, to, okay, learnings from. So, having said this, I just want to share with you some of the learnings from the UN Global Forum on Gender Statistics in Johannesburg last week. So first, I just want to mention that this forum was attended by about 250 people. Many of them are really statisticians and people in various government statistical agencies and NGOs. There were people from ministries and statistical departments from Africa, such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Lesotho, Ivory Coast, Cameroon, Morocco, Senegal, Kenya, as well as from North America, Latin America, and European countries, such as Canada, the US, Mexico, Chile, Italy, Switzerland, Finland, as well as from some countries in Asia and Pacific regions. As well, there were a lot of people from international organizations such as the UN Statistics Division, UN Women, UN SCAP, ILO, WHO, as well as African Union Commissions and UN Economic Commissions for Africa attending this forum. What I found from the forum was that that was so fascinating is that all these governments and international organization people were very interested in developing, analyzing, and communicating data on gender and care work, particularly on unpaid care work. I was surprised by this because I thought they were not that interested, but in fact, they're extremely interested. And I think the reason for this at least there are 4 reasons, I think. First is that I think there's now a real need to take stock of the UN SDGs, agenda number 5, which is gender equality, because we're now at the midpoint of the SDG, and that many of these governments and organizations are realizing that we're really far from achieving gender equality, not just in Africa, but everywhere. The second reason why people are really interested in sort of analyzing and working on care and the care economy is that there's a global recognition of the importance of care in the care economy and the need to invest in care economy. And I think it comes out of a number of directions. One, and that's a third reason, is the growing understanding from the demographic trends and demographic data about the aging population. Even in sort of hitherto still relatively young regions like Africa. And so this concern about population aging and its implications for growing demands and need for care is really, really sort of in their mind. So many of these country statisticians and government people were saying, we need to really invest in care and care economy now before it's too late. At the same time, and this is a fourth reason I think why people are really interested in care and care work, is that there are now a real push for this new agenda coming from feminist researchers and feminist economists about the importance of kind of intersecting care with new global challenges such as climate change. And so the discussion is that we might be able to achieve some kind of co-benefits for gender and climate by investing in the care economy, as many people are beginning to see care and care work as a kind of new form of green economy. So there's a real, what I found was that a real growing conversation among people in national governments and statistical agencies about the need to improve and expand gender data and data on care and care work, both paid and unpaid, and to develop more partnerships and collaborations amongst each other and with other actors and institutions such as researchers and universities and research institutions and NGOs to analyze, communicate, and mobilize this data. So I think that's why they invited me to come and talk about the kind of data that I'm gathering and how I'm analyzing the data on care and care work. So next slide, please. And this is the last slide. With this, let me now say a bit about some of the challenges and opportunities in producing such statistics in Southern Africa that was discussed at the forum. There was a lot of discussions on this topic amongst people from the Southern African countries and regional and global organizations such as African Union and the UN Economic Commission on Africa, UN Women, and other organizations. Basically, I'm going to just summarize sort of those challenges, point out to three challenges that they discussed about. First is this lack of existing data. So what I understand is that South Africa seems to have quite good data on gender and care, but many countries in Africa, not just Southern Africa, but other African countries, actually don't have much in way of data on gender. Never mind gender statistics. So, for example, a senior statistician from Lesotho's Bureau of Statistics told me about the need to support and develop surveys and implement data collections on care and gender in his country. I think it is also evident from the fact that not many countries in Africa has time use survey data. Even in countries like Kenya, which has pretty good surveys, they only began to undertake their first time use survey last year. So I think the first challenge for Southern Africa is in establishing and developing a good set of gender data, such as time use data, and other key data, such as labor force survey, census, and household surveys that are not only comprehensive, but also gender disaggregated. The second challenge is the difficulties associated with collecting data itself. So even if there is established systems of data collection, such as in South Africa, in many African countries, data collection seems to be still very difficult, as they are not always very clear or comprehensive. So one example is the basic official statistics, such as birth, death, and other civic registration data are quite incomplete and difficult to gather. We heard a lot about this coming from chief statisticians in many of the African countries. Another example I learned is that in many African countries, there are a lot of underreporting of birth and deaths, and in particular, and they have shown us this in the sort of tables and graphs, in particular, female births and deaths are not always registered in the civic registry. Now, this is really problematic, not only because it makes it difficult for the government to know how many children, boys or girls, and girls are born, but also they have other important public service implications, such as education, who gets to go to school, and healthcare, who gets access to healthcare, and social security and pension. So having more comprehensive data on birth, death, and other kinds of registries, both for female and male, are really important. I also learned that there are also some difficulties associated with marriage registry, because of the different kinds of marriage, in addition to civic marriages that happens in Africa. So such marriages as traditional, customary marriages and Muslim marriages, it's very difficult to keep those and access those data, because again, these data on marriages and households are really difficult to obtain. Again, these data are really important because of their implications for things such as access to social and healthcare services and other supports. The third challenge that's faced are cost of collecting these data. Almost every country, statisticians said, the cost of collecting these data is enormous. I know that because we do time use survey in Canada, and that's very expensive. Not just collecting, but also training people, hiring people to collect these data is really, really expensive. So now, let me talk a little bit about some of the opportunities. Just wanted to mention three. One is that, again, there is a growing recognition about the importance of care and the care economy amongst policymakers and researchers and some of the economic actors. So this is really good, because I think this is a really good moment for us to push, for us to really push for government investment in care and care economy and gender statistics. Second is that there's a growing understanding of importance of research and policy collaborations among statistical agencies, global and national actors, and they want to collaborate with people outside of the government, such as researchers and universities and research institutions. And then finally, I think there is the opportunity is that there's an increased effort by these statistical agencies and governments to communicate and elevate the role of and values of gender statistics. So again, I think this is really, really good, because it indicates that government departments and statistical agencies are more open to working with researchers and institutions outside of the government to develop better analysis of the data and to communicate the importance of gender statistics and the care economy. Okay, I'll stop here and open for discussion. Could you, yeah, thank you. Sorry if we went a little bit long.
No, thank you so much for that, Prof. I mean, that was, you know, I'm delighted that you shared some of the conversations that were being had in Johannesburg. Much of what you said, you know, is familiar to those of us who have been working on marriage, births or deaths or families and the complexities of collecting information, even qualitatively, never mind kind of national, like quantitative data sets. I do have a couple of questions from what you said, and I think I might kick off in that way. I think what we'll do is I will share some of these thoughts, particularly as it relates to the context. We know this is a global, you know, question and series of questions. But when you mentioned, first of all, and I'm particularly interested in this, obviously, from the perspective of our program, the Family Caregiving of Older Persons program that's happening in Southern Africa in 4 countries. Because whilst we know that this is one of the largest growing populations, it's an aging population, it's rapidly aging to the point that it's going to, in South Africa, represent 20% of the population in about 25 years. We don't see the attention yet, the political will or investment, either funding or just even kind of sensitivities to the areas or issues around the care economy. Now, in the Southern African context, you've got to think about the multiple care crises, notwithstanding the latest pandemic. There's been a series of pandemics, epidemics over time. And that much of the care work, as you probably are familiar with, has been cushioning, like much of the unpaid care work, I should say, has been cushioning all the gaps in economic policies and social policies. And that's something we see repeatedly over the last 30 years. So I'm a little bit skeptical. I'm motivated by the fact that you said at the meeting people were enthusiastic about collecting data, but I'm still very skeptical about what data can do and how far it can push and whether it can convince politicians or Minister for Finance, as you give in your example, you know, about the value, you know. Mm-hmm. So the first thing, so that's the broader point I want to just talk about. The first thing is about, you mentioned the quality and the meaning of the data, right? Mm-hmm. And this goes to the skepticism that I often have, and forgive me for that, as you know, first of all, about how we conceptualize care. So essential to good quality, right, is what do we mean by care? And yes, we know that there are very good survey data in South Africa. You know, I'll give South Africa as the example, and it may not be shared across the region, but time use surveys do exist. They have their limitations. Labour force surveys exist. General household survey data exists. Gendered questions can be posed of this data. But a lot of that material is really looking at how care is defined in very kind of crude ways, you know, numbers of minutes spent on often body work, i.e. the practical time, like the time one spends for practically caring for someone, doesn't really get it into the forms of conceptualizations of care that we're thinking of providing for, taking care of people. So whether that's providing housing, whether that's providing money, like financial support, supporting in terms of agricultural work, you know. And so there's a whole range of gaps in how data sets conceptualize care and unpaid care work, and what really happens on the ground as people understand care. In addition to that, then you have all the forms of kind of cognitive labor that we're very much aware of that are essential, particularly in relation to childcare and thinking about the work we do in facilitating others and other people's involvement in care. But also just the management and the organization of care, all of that work. In time use surveys, that it often gets categorized as household maintenance. But if you're the older person you're looking after has diabetes, and this is something we experience all the time, and you're managing the preparation of food, first of all, you're trying to figure out how to finance the food, but then you're also trying to manage what to cook so that it's healthy and it does this, that, and the other. All of that labor, all of that unpaid care work isn't conceptualized. It doesn't get captured in time use survey in the ways that is meaningful. So that's the first query I have, and real kind of skepticism I have about measuring sometimes what is the, the invisible, what is care? The second is the limitations, that what we really want is an integration of data sets. We don't want to go to the time use survey data set for measuring the number of minutes and hence the number of hours, and hence we can get an economic value to this. But then we have to go to the labor force survey to see really good indicators of work activities, particularly in places like Southern Africa, where understandings of work are so complicated. There's so much that can be categorized as work that doesn't get captured in either labor force surveys, general household surveys. And related to that is how we think about families, because you will spend your lifetime trying to figure out good questions that can fit in a survey that will capture the complexity of household movement with and membership of households over time, over place. And that's where you begin to tear your hair out as a researcher in trying to think about how do we actually measure that. Okay, so they're the two questions I have about the quality and meaning of data, the limitations of how care is defined. Obviously, even in places like South Africa that has very good data sets, the limitations of them both in the conceptualization, but also in how they are completely divided into different data sets, that some have good indicators of income, some don't. Some attempt to have good indicators of care activities, and which don't then aren't translated into the other data sets. So it's very patchy, and it's not comprehensive, even, as I say, in places where there's great attempts. So that's on the one hand, right? I don't know if you want to respond to that now, or if I should continue with this kind of the political will kind of question. So, I mean, do you want me to continue? Okay, so you talk about like calculating the size, right, of unpaid care work. What happens if there is a big danger in bringing that? If you even could capture that, if you could quantify, measure, and get an economic value. What if we were to say that actually over time there's been a disinvestment in existing care, social, let's call it social care for want of a better word, direct care provision in our society, right? So the government is already spending less. So it's not that it's just not compensating or recognizing the unpaid care work. It's already cutting back on the care support it provides. And that's what we see happening here, at least in South Africa. I won't speak for other countries just yet. We're yet to do that analysis. But can we really convince, and can we really think that just by measuring the value of the unpaid care work, that the Minister for Finance and the relevant ministries are really going to wake up and say, actually, we do need to start compensating or recognizing through tangible mechanisms the unpaid care work that goes hand. There's a lot to be said with the very direct familialistic policies that exist in the region and why they're there, the work that they do, the kind of covering up that they do. And that leads to the third point, which I think I started with, is that gender alone isn't going to get us far enough. In the region, we have in particular very important gender and generational intersections on unpaid caregiving in particular, paid work as well, but unpaid caregiving taking place. So I started off by saying, older persons in particular have been cushioning many of the gaps in social policies, economic policies that, and that have been pretty much been allowed to happen over decades. And I'm not even just talking about, more recent trends and thinking about the care economy. So I think we really need to take generation also seriously in when we're talking about gender statistics. We're talking, obviously, about intersectional kind of lens of thinking through gender and with gender, but that's particularly important in the unpaid care sector in the region.
Wow, thank you. No, these are really important points, and I'm not sure whether I could answer all of them, but I would certainly love to sort of try and engage, do my best to kind of address some of those your questions. So first is about sort of defining and measuring care and what is care. I think we spent a lot of time talking about this as well, and yes, I mean, certainly the time use survey is, just to take that as an example, as it stands right now, is inadequate. I mean, never mind countries that doesn't even have time use survey, So, but with many of us who are using time use surveys, we've been talking a lot about this, about making time use survey much more specific about and inclusive in terms of comprehensive, in terms of the kind of care work that happens. So we want to, I mean, certainly in my project, we try to define care in a very broad sense. So in our survey, we do ask questions, not just in time use, but in our survey of unpaid caregiving, we ask questions about both direct and indirect form of care. So that, like, direct being that kind of hands-on, as well as indirect being kind of supervisory and adjunct care. We also do the qualitative survey just to get a much better sense of how exactly people are not just spending the time, but thinking about, the care. So things like, organizing and managing care, sort of who does that, how is it being done, sort of what it means in terms of your sort of time management, mental health, physical health, sense of well-being, that kind of thing. So yes, that kind of cognitive management type form of care is really, really important. So I think there are two things that we need to say, and we still have to kind of push forward. One is for those people and for those countries that are already doing time use surveys. And right now, something like 100 somewhat countries are doing this, but they need to make it much more sensitive to the different types of care that happens. That's one. But then the second, and maybe it's more fundamental, and this is the things that I'm beginning to learn about from the UN statistical division, is that actually implementing, getting countries that don't even have time use surveys, and that's this kind of surveys, to start doing the surveys, so we would have a better sense. And here, seemed to me, their issue is the survey is already, the time use survey is already so time consuming and in depth. That not all the countries want to engage in it because of its time, how much it takes to do. And so on the one hand, we want to make it much more comprehensive. On the other hand, in order to get countries to do it, they also feel like they have to kind of tone down the complexity, simplify it. So I see the kind of the pull in both directions, and I don't know what the answer is, but I think we need to get more countries. One is that we need to get more countries to engage in it, and secondly, we need to then, once they're engaged in it, kind of really begin to pull open the different dimensions of care and care work, particularly in unpaid care work. So that's just kind of, I'm not sure whether it's an adequate answer to your first question. Second question about integration of data. This is really interesting because what's happening is, I think many statistical agencies, in national statistical agencies, not just in Africa, but in also other parts of the world, really feel, this is just my sense, feel like they've been kind of being left out, or they're being feeling like they're gonna get sort of pushed aside if they don't do something. And I think there's a real kind of sense of the desire to kind of expand the innovate on the data set. And one of the areas where they're innovating is in integrating data from other survey forms. So not just integrating time use with the labor force or with the general demographic or household surveys, but for example, was it Kenya? A few other countries have begun to integrate their household and time use survey with the national what do you call those? National Revenue Agency survey on trades. So they're looking at the data, sharing data and statistics on the sort of cross-border trades and the flow of the money, and how that figures, how that relates to gender. So they're disaggregating that way, and so there seems to be there's some interesting sort of innovations and attempt to integrate data set. They know that like what we have is not enough, and different government departments have different sets of data that needs to be kind of sort of integrated with each other. So I think there's some movement toward that. I'm particularly curious about that integration of the revenue agency data, disaggregated between men and women and between different economic groups and geolocations to to finding out about care and unpaid care economy. I know also, I think it's statistics South Africa. They're also using geolocational data to look at the sort of access to such care as education, healthcare. And so some of the studies has found that if you're located further away from the access point for healthcare or the schools, chance of kids going to school gets progressively less, or the women's death rate, during the birth gets increased. So there's some really interesting data happening here, and that's sort of really through the integration of the different data sets. So some of the people like Ranji, I forgot her last name, in the Ministry of Family and Gender and Disability, were really talking about your third point and question about family and household movement. And clearly, this is really, really important. As it was pointed out, that intergenerational caregiving, particularly grandparent caring, that's very, very serious because of the HIV/AIDS and other migrations and other forms of care. I think that's not just African thing, but I think it's also quite universal, because even if you look at Canada, what we're finding is that quite a lot of immigrant families really rely on the grandparents, to the point where they're bringing in grandparents on visitors visa so that they could look after their grandchildren. So that kind of data we really, really do need. And this, again, points to the importance of kind of intersecting different policy fields, right? So here we're suddenly looking at not just about gender and care, we're looking at employment, labor force, migration, immigration, all these policies, these have to come together, and they don't really speak to each other, which I think is really, really unfortunate. And then your last point and skepticisms about, okay, after all this, like, even calculating the size of the unpaid care work and its contribution to economy, should government care about this? Does government care about this? I think so. So I think if there's anything good that has come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that is like at least put care and the care economy on sort of as one of the government policy agenda, at least maybe not in Southern Africa, but in other parts of the world. That has become a really big thing, because suddenly when parents were forced to work from home, both mothers and fathers were pulling their hair out and saying, gosh, do something, that have to do this. And so at least in the global north, that the care and care economy has become a real policy issue. And I think the strategy, for me anyway, the strategy here is really to change that social and political narratives about care and the care economy, not just as a kind of the sort of drain on the economy or burden on the family, but as a kind of sort of a positive incentive, for the economy. And that's why we've been kind of working quite a bit on calculating the GDP contribution of the unpaid care work. We did this with South Korea a few years ago, where we basically did use that data and calculated the economic contribution of unpaid care work, particularly care of the older people, and use that to develop macroeconomic model of the care economy. And what we did was we asked for policy dialogue with the government ministries. And what's interesting is in my work, which is gender and care policies, normally the ministries that come to the table are Ministry of Gender Equality, Ministry of Health and Welfare, and maybe Ministry of Employment, I don't know. But this time when we say, okay, we have macroeconomic models and we could give you projections of economy and how it's going to look like, given the demographic data and all these, Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Economic Planning came. And we actually said, look, you've got to do this, because the care economy is going to be the next biggest economic growth area. Why are you sitting on this and doing nothing about it? Invest in care. And what's amazing is that they haven't changed their tune immediately, but they are slowly trying to put more money into that sector, because their new narrative is it's a new economic engine. Now, I'm not sure how they're going to take that, but it's at least it opens a door, and I'm really hoping that, I know WHO and ILO and UN people are all saying, look at the demographics and exactly Africa. You might be having, dividend right now, demographic dividend right now, but it's going to pass in no time. In the blink of eyes, Africa is going to start aging. What are you going to do about this? Isn't this a time to really focus on, care and care economy and start investing rather than wasting this opportunity? So I think we need to change that political narrative.
I'm very glad you not ended. We're going to open it up to questions from everybody now. But I mean, the positive, reframing of the issues. I see. Maybe I'll take a round of questions. I see Lona has her hand up, and if anyone else wants to put their hand up or pop a question in the box, we can by all means pose it. So Lona, you go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Peng, for presenting this. My question is actually very, very basic, but I just want to say I'm doing my PhD and really looking at seeing care as an investment and not as a drain on the economy. But it's not from an economic point of view. it is from a social scientist point of view. The very simple question I have for you is, you spoke about your project, Care Economies in Context, and mentioned that you're looking at, I think it was 9 different countries in 4 different regions. I'm just wondering, and you mentioned it included Africa. I very quickly looked on your website. There looks like there's fascinating articles, which I will be working through. But I just wonder, what is your African countries? Have you identified them yet? That's it. It's a very, very simple question, but I really look forward to reading your group's work and learning from you.
Oh, thank you very much, Lona, for that question. So the 2 African countries are Kenya and Senegal. And I have to say, the part of the reason is that we could have tried many countries as well, but part of the sort of necessary conditions for us to have the country is that we have somebody in each of these countries who will lead that project, and that country lead will have to have the following people in their team. Well, someone who's connected to the National Statistical Agency so that we could access the data, someone who could do both empirical work, both quantitative and qualitative work, someone who could do the policy analysis, and someone who are also sort of able to work collectively with other countries in a kind of comparative perspectives. There were a lot of different possibilities, but at that moment we had contacts in both Senegal and Kenya, so we decided to go with them. Finally, they have to have in the team, each country team, they have to have a macroeconomist who could do macroeconomic modeling. So these were some of the conditions. Since we started that project in 2021, many other countries, like Cameroon and South Africa, actually South African Statistical Agency wants to work with us, so we may expand, but already with 9 countries we were really busy. But I think we could start with this and see how it goes, and then we could expand some more. I should give you other countries as well. We also have 2 in Latin America, Colombia and Costa Rica, 3 in Asia, Mongolia, Sri Lanka and South Korea, and 2 what we call high-income OECD countries, Canada and Italy. Italy because they have such a huge aging population in Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks, Lona. There's building work going on upstairs, so if you hear that, I apologize. Any other questions? I see Janet has popped a question in the chat box. Janet, I don't know if you're still there. Oh, you are. Go ahead, Janet.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Janet.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation on time use. And I've seen that Namibia have not been really that much actively involved in time use surveys, but I've been Googling and I found that there are some time use surveys for children activities and looking at it related to well-being in rural northern Namibia. I was just interested in any lessons on time use, not surveys, but qualitative data, how you go about it to collect qualitative data on time use, because this is what our focus is in our current study. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Qualitative data is very difficult to collect, particularly along the time use. So for our project, we actually created a harmonized questionnaire for which each country team could add of course, the country-specific questions for both large end surveys as of unpaid caregiving, as well as qualitative interview surveys to follow. So, for example, in Canada, we did the large end surveys of unpaid caregiving. That includes how much time you spend and how you're organizing, who's deciding, whose decision was it that you become the main caregivers and that kind of thing. So we did the large end survey with the unpaid childcare group, as well as unpaid care of older people group. And then in the last question, we asked, would you be interested in follow-up interview questions, so qualitative questions? So it took us like more than 8 months to do it. And we managed to do 50 interviews each for childcare and care of older people. But it is difficult because it's time consuming. It's also, trying to sort of transcribe and put those data together has been a lot of work. I have 10 PhD students working on that for the last half year, interviewing, transcribing, analyzing, and all these. So it does take time, but what's really interesting, what's good is that it really does give you that insight that you absolutely cannot get from regular time use survey. So I've been encouraging, I don't know whether they would do it, national statistical agencies, like do qualitative, like just having one large survey, just get us, it will give you a sense of what's going on. But in order to really understand, you need to have qualitative survey. I know Columbia team did a very good qualitative survey on this. So some countries are taking on, but I think not all the countries are able to or willing to.
Thanks, Prof. And that's what we're trying to do here in Namibia and Malawi and South Africa and Botswana. So we're getting there. And Michelle, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. I had a couple of questions. And the first one was if you had any gender statistics of who received.
Prof, can you hear her?
From you.
I can't.
Yeah, Michelle, we can't really hear you very well. Either your volume is low or perhaps maybe your mic is not off. We can hear you very, very faintly.
Okay, I don't see the problem this side. I might type my question in.
Sorry, Michelle. Do you want to perhaps type it in the box or try again? It's just it's very, very faint. I think Michelle is typing. Thanks, Michelle. Sorry.
Thank you.
In the meantime, are there any other questions? I know, Lona, is that an old hand? Yeah, I think that is an old hand.
Yes, that's an old. I thought I put it down. Is it down?
Okay, no worries. Yeah, it's down. Don't worry, it's fine. Thanks, Lona. So Michelle asked whether there are any gender statistics about who received care. I don't know if that's a specific country that you're looking at, Michelle.
So
any country. Okay.
Any country. So the data on who receives care, I can say about Canada. There is quite a lot of data on who receives care and who gives care. And in our own survey, we have been doing the sort of care giving and care receiving. The data that we have is that we actually have quite a lot of people that we would normally think of those who are receiving care are children, children under the age of 15 or something like that, and people over the age of 65. But in fact, we are finding quite a lot of people are also receiving care who are in a kind of the much larger demographic range, particularly during the COVID period, because we did our survey during the COVID. Young people receiving care has really increased a lot, and that's care not only in terms of the physical, so kind of direct care, but also in different forms of care, like particularly through mental health and emotional care, as well as a lot of what we call financial and economic care. So young people returning back home and co-residing with parents and things like that. So what we learned from our surveys is that the caregiving and care receiving has increased quite a lot and involve much larger group of people than we had traditionally thought about. And so again, going back to really Elena's first questions about how do we define care, I think that definition of care and who gets to who gets care and who give care has really expanded.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. I mean, just what to add on to that, Michelle, I think you also raise a very good point that if we are to understand care, seeing it through the eyes of the care receiver is an essential part, if anything. And I think if it's following the thread that maybe you were alluding to, Michelle, but a lot of the care recipients get written out of survey work or any work for a range of reasons, perhaps due to quote unquote vulnerability. And I think that, what you can find also is that some of the data that might exist would be in aging surveys. If you're looking at the older persons, but that's usually not speaking to care. That's speaking to very particular understandings of health and perhaps daily activities or living, daily kind of capabilities, but not necessarily social care as one might imagine it otherwise. And so there, I don't know, Michelle, if this was your way of thinking, that there are big gaps potentially there in how we can think through care if we're not listening to care recipients' direct experiences and reporting, because a lot of the statistics that do exist are from other people's perspective about the care they give to care recipients. Yeah, but other aging surveys do have it. Yeah.
And I just want to add to that, we often think of sort of receiving and giving care as a kind of unidirectional. What we found out, particularly with the care of the older people, is that those older people who are receiving care are often also giving care at the same time. And so you could be both carer recipient and care giver, at the very, very same time. Slightly different kinds of care, but that notion of unidirectional caregiving, care receiving really seem to me doesn't apply. So I think we need to have a much more sort of flexible, definition of care and care work.
Absolutely. I'm just going to see if there's any other questions from the floor as such. There doesn't seem to be any hands up.
Good.
And so I'm going to, I think we can close it off. I am going to say a big thank you to Professor Ito Peng for joining us today, and for I look forward to chatting further with you this afternoon about some of these issues and more. And we're very grateful for your insights and for sharing what you were hearing also in Johannesburg. That was helpful for us to hear some of those insights. And I hope we hear from you soon. And many thanks again from everyone, I think, here today. We really appreciate the insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is great to meet this group. I'm glad we had a chance to sort of share information. So thank you.